right now, you know, what is the meaningful check against the United States Supreme Court? There's none. We can't get a constitutional amendment. What can the president do other than just non-acquiescence, which I assume you wouldn't support?
No, I wouldn't.
The Supreme Court was never intended to be the supreme branch. Never. They may have been supreme in their very narrow land, their very narrow lane, excuse me, but otherwise they're supposed to fuck off and let the vast majority of governing be done by the president and the Congress.
I want to let Econoboy and Stacks in, but I just have a quick response to that is think about, not all the cases, but a lot of the major cases that you're citing where the Supreme Court has got it extremely wrong, in my opinion. Let's start with Dobbs. Dobbs was a right invented by the court, even though I agree with Roe v. Wade. We wouldn't even have that right to discuss with if we didn't have a judicial review of a Texas law. And so this is a case where you're disagreeing with the court using overturning a previous use of judicial review. And so it seems incongruous to be mad at the court for even having judicial review or thinking they're being inappropriate about it when the case that you like that they're overturning is a prime example of judicial review. And then the second one, real quick, this recent case of Section 3, the court was saying you need legislation and you can't just self-execute, and we're giving it to Congress. And so to the extent that the court is imposing anything, it's just saying that you need to go through the political branches, which is what you're professing to say that they want anyway. It would seem, now I disagree with the court. I think the court is putting limitation on the state abilities to act here, but they're not usurping the role of at least in those two examples, of the legislatures in that respect, at least not the legislators in Congress. They're giving Congress that authority. And the last case, I think, where it does go to your point is the Biden student loan example, where they are striking down a policy from the executive. But what they're saying is that Congress didn't legislate it. So you can spin that as them upholding the rights of the Congress to.
They do all sorts of clever sleights of hand. I'll respond to that. But again, Stacks and Econoboy, if you guys want to jump in about.
Yeah, can I actually just clarify your position, Pisco? Because when asked about term limits, you mentioned that it wasn't politically feasible. But like, do you feel like it's like, is it political feasibility, or are you also like morally opposed to term limits? Like, if it was political feasible, would you go for it?
I'm against it substantively and politically. Yeah, I think that it's really good to have them to have these people be insulated, and giving them term limits would, I think.
I mean, there's ways to. I don't know. I disagree with this idea that you have to have a lifetime. I mean, we're Americans, right? We don't believe in lifetime offices except for Supreme Court justices, basically, right?
All federal judges. So this includes every federal.
Well, yeah,
federal
good
judges
behavior,
well, right?
Let's just be clear. The basis for this is Article 3 or Section 3, or Article 3 of the Constitution.
Right. So long as you have good behavior or whatever. Right? Yeah. I mean, I don't. There's obviously ways, and there's ways that other democracies have found to essentially cycle through justices in a way that politically insulates them, but is also appropriate for changing times, right? I mean, the Democrats will wheel out this quote from Thomas Jefferson where he says something like, "It would be absurd for a document 17 years old to govern the people of a modern day," or something like that. And whereas Thomas Jefferson had this more radical view that the Constitution should be sort of regularly amended in an ordinary process generationally. Because that's just a fairly reasonable position to take. And so you could have term limits as well as sort of, independent committees that provide the initial screening process for nominees to the court. This is what I think the UK does, where they have sort of an independent judiciary committee that provides sort of, hey, Prime Minister, here's 5 people that you can nominate. And then the Prime Minister picks amongst the 5 that have already been screened. And then it's typically a ceremonial appointment process because you've already got the independent judiciary process as well. I think Canada does something similar. I think they have term limits for their justices as well.
They have mandatory retirement ages, I believe Canada does.
Okay,
they
sure,
have some sort of function, yeah.
And so I just don't think that we need lifetime appointment. We don't have a lifetime appointed Federal Reserve chair, but the Federal Reserve is incredibly politically insulated. And I don't think that you need anything. I don't think term limits do anything differently to the court. I think that they
wouldn't be insulated. I just want to say they wouldn't be insulated if they were expounding on the meaning of like the Second Amendment. If the Federal Reserve, I understand that Federal Reserve wields enormous power and maybe even more day-to-day power on the American life of a regular person through their use of monetary policy. Understood. But if they were ruling on issues to the import of the American people, the way the Supreme Court would, there would not be an insulation politically, and it would be very, very different, in my opinion.
Well, no, I mean,
also, I just want to point out.
I think you should have a one-term limit, right? So if you wanted to say like, hey, if you're going to be appointed to the Supreme Court, you have a 1-term limit and it's 10 years or something, where, you know, in theory, you don't have a lot of motivation to, you know, politically justify your opinions going forward because you know that you're only going to have a 1-term limit as well. That kind of goes into the second point that I was going to make, which is that I think people have like economics brain where, you know, like a lot of wonky people on Twitter will say shit like, oh, you know, we shouldn't have subsidized renewables. We should just tax carbon. And that's like per dollar, the exact same thing. And it's like, okay, well, you know, if you want to just, you know, throw all politics and sort of context out, that's one thing. But I think it's the same thing with justices. You know, I think that Thurgood Marshall, when he was getting nominated to the court, he said something along the lines of, well, the way that I make my rulings is I kind of just try to do what I think is right and then let the law catch up. And he got criticized for that. But the reality is I think that literally every single justice just has some sort of moral foundation that they use, and then they judge in accordance with that. And I know that people like Scalia will say things like, oh, no. Every good judge will make decisions that he or she personally disagrees with. I don't think that he's telling the truth. I think that every single one of these justices is hyperly politically motivated, not because they feel the pressure of getting thrown out by the voters or anything like that, but I think that these are conservatives and liberals on the Supreme Court, and they are ruling accordingly. The best example of that, the last thing that I'll say is, when Amy Coney Barrett was up for appointment, Dick Durbin was questioning her on one of the decisions she made, which was that basically she said that felons would be allowed to own guns, and that it actually was unconstitutional when she was a circuit judge when she ruled that felons who are barred from owning guns, actually that's unconstitutional. To which Dick Durbin said, well, I thought you're a textualist. I thought you just read the text of the law and then you apply the law. Well, you're not a Supreme Court justice when you're making this decision. You're a federal justice. The law says people who are felons cannot own guns. And what she said was, well, I went back into the history and I discovered all this context and I basically found a way to rule against it. She is a person who is a conservative and she makes conservative rulings. I don't think we can pretend that these court justices are some apolitical body.
If you heard me to be like a formalist or some person who believes the law exists in some real space somewhere, I'm a realist before I'm any of that, right? So I agree that these are people, these are human beings with failings and biases and all that stuff. And I understand that these people have their biases, and I don't dispute that. And I don't dispute that they'll give certain benefits of the doubts to one party or one political view versus others. And, you know, you've seen it happen. And I think there's a lot of examples of very polarized topics in which there's a clear division along sort of ideological lines. That's true. Yep. But I do agree that the Supreme Court is the most reasoned branch, despite that, because they have to put out their opinions. And I do think that sometimes they or often they're more united than you think. Recall, we're talking about in the context of a 9-0 decision. So whatever the split was here, there are 9 justices who disagreed with me. The liberals came with the conservatives, met and said, hey, this was not okay, and we're undoing what Colorado did. And so, first of all, there's more agreement than I think you're giving them credit for. And sometimes the splits aren't what you expect them to be. And so, yes, I agree with you that these are ultimately people who are fallible, who are political. But that doesn't mean the institution as a whole is not worth preserving, and that because you can't perfectly insulate, that no insulation is needed or necessary.
No, I said what my reforms would be, which would be having sort of an independent committee and some sort of term limit, right? I don't think that the institution of the Supreme Court should go away, but I do think that a lot of conservatives and like more like establishment politician types, and I'm not saying that's a Pisco, obviously. I'm just saying that generally this rhetoric that I hear is, well, the Supreme Court is infallible. This is just an apolitical branch of people.
Who says that nowadays? I'm going to call you on that. Who says that, Econo Boy?
Dude, are you kidding me? Like every time the Democrats talk about adding court seats, people will say, "Oh my goodness, that's so partisan. You're packing the court." And it's like every politician packs the court with people who politically agree with them. This is not a new thing. This is not an unusual thing. I don't disagree with that, but I don't agree that your assessment that people are viewing the court as apolitical is correct. I mean, I think if you look at the public perception of the legitimacy of perception, yes, I'm talking about
but at least the establishment types. I don't hear any Democrat. I mean, Biden went on stage and is like, "I'm sorry, justices, but I'm gonna do some shit to undo what you did." I mean, if that is not a
okay, that's a really good pivot point right there, because also bridges where we were at the beginning. Do you take issue with that? A lot of people.
No. Okay, I don't take issue with that, because if I'm hearing Biden to say something that is not in conflict with the court's ruling, just like the student loan, where they're like, he's defying the Constitution. No, if you are using a certain authority to do some policy and the court rules against that, and says you can't do it this way, then you can try other ways, just like Trump did with his Muslim bans. He tried the first one, and then he tried a second one, tried a third one, and then the third one was the one the Supreme Court said that, hey, that's actually okay to do. And so it's not the case that because Biden is saying, I don't agree with you, I'm going to make some changes, I don't have a problem with that. That's as long as what he's proposing is a constitutional thing, something that is, what if he pulled an exercise.
What if he pulled an FDR and threatened to try to court pack? What if he was a bit,
specifically or generally just saying
the Supreme Court? So right now there's a federal statute which locks the Supreme Court's composition at 9 justices. That it's been the case for 150 years. It can be overturned. So Biden, if Biden said, listen, I'm going to make it very reductive, just so we're all on the same page. If he basically took the posture, I'm the president of the United States. I am not your subordinate. We are supposed to be co-equals. So you fuck with me a little bit. Now I'm going to start fucking with you a little bit. And if my party takes majorities in both chambers, I'm going to repeal that federal statute and pack the court. I would argue, to the extent that there are checks and balances which flow from the president to the Supreme Court, FDR's threat of a court pack was an example of the president using a bully pulpit to say, chill. You can't be striking down all my shit 24/7. Back off.